There's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution, and 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are: teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976 they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money, but do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
Science is dependent upon isolating a system in order to study it, but this is literally impossible. Everything has an effect on everything else in our universe. Every single particle of matter has some gravitational effect on every other particle of matter. Irrespective of how much we try to isolate something, the concept of an isolated system that has zero interaction with its environment is really just a theoretical one that does not exist in reality. This simple insight literally destroys the entire scientific enterprise, because science is dependent upon this capacity to isolate systems. Because if we want to say A causes B, then we need to be able to control for all other variables, that is, remove them from the equation. As we have stated, this is not possible. So how do we get around this stumbling block, as it appears that the scientific endeavor goes on without this causing too much of a problem? What we do, because we can't fully isolate any system, is essentially define what are significant effects and what are negligible effects, and simply forget about the negligible effects. So for example, if I'm doing research in my lab on the interaction between two particles of matter, under this premise, I do not need to take into account the gravitational effect that some planet the other side of the universe is having on these particles, because it is deemed negligible. This basic premise that small causes can only cause relatively small effects is one of the basic assumptions and principles that gives our world some order. We depend upon it almost all day, every day. I feel confident in the fact that if I forget to pay my bank overdraft this week, it is not going to bring the whole global economy into meltdown, or that a teeny little pinprick is not going to kill me. We find order in this world in the fact that the chances of these phenomena happening are so small that they are negligible, and we can thus forget about them. Without this being the case in linear systems, our world would be extraordinarily random and chaotic. But as we've previously discussed, nonlinear systems through feedback loops can grow exponentially. This means that negligible effects or differences within nonlinear systems can themselves grow in an exponential fashion, where small effects and errors are fed back into the system at each stage of its development, to compound the size of error as it grows at an exponential fashion. As was the case in the famous Edouard Lorenz computer experiment, where when he fed values into the computer that he thought were exactly the same, the output results that the computer gave him were widely divergent. He eventually traced this back to small differences in the rounding errors that made the values only very slightly different, but through iteration, these very small errors would grow, not in a linear fashion, but exponentially, making the resulting outputs widely divergent within a relatively short period of time, and thus giving us the phenomena that is called sensitivity to initial conditions. Sensitivity to initial conditions is popularly known as the butterfly effect, thought to be so called because of the title of a talk given by Edouard Lorenz in 1972, called "Does the Flap of a Butterfly's Wings in Brazil Set Off a Tornado in Texas?" The flapping wing represents a small change in the initial conditions of the system, which causes a chain of events leading to some large-scale phenomena. Had the butterfly not flapped its wings, the future trajectory of the system might have been very different. Something to note here is that the butterfly does not directly cause the tornado. This is, of course, impossible. The flap of the butterfly's wings simply defines some initial conditions. It is then the set of chain reactions through feedback loops that enable a small change in the initial conditions of the system to have a significant effect on its output, rendering long-term predictions virtually impossible. With respect to the unpredictable nature of the butterfly effect, you might say this: well, if our initial measurement is wrong, then obviously our prediction of its future state is also going to be wrong. But this is missing the point, which is firstly that this inaccuracy is growing exponentially as the system develops. It is not just staying the same. And secondly, that in these nonlinear systems, we can never know exactly the starting conditions, as our accuracy of measurement must grow in an exponential fashion in order to achieve just a linear growth in our horizon of predictability. Chaos and the butterfly effect, after being shunned by the scientific community for many decades, are today accepted as scientific facts, a fundamental and inescapable part of the dynamics to nonlinear systems. They show again how, when things can grow exponentially, we can get extraordinary and counterintuitive results.